conducted to commemorate the promulgation of an encyclical by Pope Leo XIII on 15th May 1891, commonly referred to by the title Rerum Novarum. Written at a time of great social upheaval following the Industrial Revolution, Rerum Novarum addressed the rights and responsibilities of capital and labour. It was seminal as it was the first encyclical in the modern era dealing with matters of social concern. Rerum Novarum was pivotal in the development of the principles of Catholic social teaching. Indeed, just a short 2 months after its promulgation, Miriam McKelp wrote of its existence in her diary. When she was visiting foster children, she said that she saw one particular boy, but she also heard from the Bishop of Sandhurst at the same time of a decree from the Pope. Since then, it's formed the basis for many encyclicals, since they have concerned themselves with social issues of the time, reflected in the light of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. In 2016, the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference issued a statement titled, "A Place at the Table, Social Justice in an Ageing Society." This educated and well-researched statement in the tradition of Rerum Novarum provides the Catholic faithful and wider community with a reasoned argument against the introduction of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. On that basis, tonight's oration is, I believe, a hope-filled response to the passage of Victoria's so-called assisted dying legislation. I now call upon Bishop Mark as MC to commence this evening's formalities.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Mark. And let me start straight away by inviting Augustine up to lead us in our acknowledgement of country.
The Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne exists on the traditional land of the people of the Kulin Nation. The past cannot be undone, but honest recognition of past injustices can lead to measures and attitudes which will help to rectify the damaging effects for both Indigenous community and the wider society. Therefore, in humility, we confess that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have been wronged through our actions and inactions. The proud people of the Kulin Nation were dispossessed from these lands for the erroneous application of the principle of terra nullius. We walk in the footsteps of elders such as William Cooper, and so Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne commits herself to walking in solidarity with our Indigenous brothers and sisters on their journey for justice and reconciliation. We invite all people of goodwill to be part of that journey.
And now I'd like to acknowledge Christ's presence. So Mark mentioned before that there's a spectrum of people of belief here, and for those of us who are maybe more at my end of the spectrum, I think it's helpful for us to just become aware of Christ present in our midst, because we know with the eyes of faith that He's alive, that He's risen, that He's powerful, and if He's really here, He can really do stuff. So I ask Him for the changing of hearts, particularly the changing of my heart and the changing of perhaps all of our hearts, as we listen with really open minds tonight. I'd like to invite Luke up to lead us in prayer.
Let us pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of all creation, you are timeless and beyond all ages. We who are growing old pray that we may face our death with serenity and dignity. We who are not yet old pray that we affirm the sacredness of each person's life and accompany those who are dying with gentleness and deep respect. God of endless love, help us to understand that we share a common life journey, a call to live life to the full, and to strive to enable all creation to come to the fullness of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Our two speakers tonight are very distinguished practitioners in the field of emergency medicine and palliative care. And I think, maybe by their nature, they're examples of hope. I think doctors are incredibly hope-filled. When I think somebody's just about dying, they think they could still save them. But both Stephen and Natasha were they were tireless in their efforts to try and persuade politicians at the time that we were considering the legislation that the legislation wasn't a good idea. And I think that of what I know of them, I think they represent really what's good and what's noble about humans and humanity. So I'm really pleased to be able to hear them tonight and invite them forward. Our first speaker tonight will be Dr. Stephen Parnas. He's the former Vice President of the AMA and currently an emergency physician at St Vincent's. And so Steve, I invite you to come forward and open the batting for us.
Thank you very much, Bishop Mark, for that very kind introduction. I also wish to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and to pay my respect to their elders. I'm honoured to be speaking alongside my colleague Natasha tonight as Victoria comes to terms with the fact that it will soon be legal for assisted suicide or euthanasia to be administered to certain individuals. I'm mindful of the landmark letter entitled Rerum Novarum, also known as the Rights and Duties of Capital and Labour. I first came to know about Rerum Novarum when I was at university, and I was struck by the importance of the protection of the vulnerable. In that case, the right of workers to form industrial unions in order to resist those who would seek to exploit them for personal gain. I also noted the fact that the letter sought to balance the legitimate rights of individuals with the responsibility to act in the common good. Both of these themes, protection of the vulnerable and balancing individual autonomy against the common good, are front and centre in the ongoing debate about end-of-life care being held in this state, across this nation, and around some parts of the developed world. The fact is that 12 months ago, the Victorian Parliament narrowly passed a law which established legal circumstances for assisted suicide and euthanasia. Mechanisms are now being put in place to enable that law to take effect from the 19th of June next year. I argued then that it was deeply flawed, and I don't resolve from that position for one moment. The obvious question which must be asked is, where to from here? And it needs to be asked by each and every one of us, by doctors, nurses and health professionals, and by every institution which cares for the sick, such as hospitals, nursing homes and hospices. I say that the answers to that question lie in three key areas. One is gaining a better understanding of what it means to be dying, what I call death literacy, and others might call facing the reality that we and those we love are mortal. Two is in subjecting these new Victorian laws to the greatest possible scrutiny, and in continuing to resist the attempts being made elsewhere to have assisted suicide and euthanasia made legal. Three is, ultimately, to render these laws redundant. I believe that can be done if a concerted effort is made to practice end-of-life care in the way it always should be practiced, with knowledge and confidence, appropriate resources and undoubted expertise. I now turn to death literacy. When I was elected State President of the Australian Medical Association in 2012, I stated that my highest priority was to improve the provision of end-of-life care. That was and remains a monumental task, requiring years of concerted effort by government, the health professions, and indeed the entire community. It essentially asks for a significant cultural shift in the way many Australians view the end of their own lives and those of their loved ones. Why did I make this my highest priority? Put simply, it's because I think Australians have generally been seduced by the notion that medical technology and expertise is the ticket to a fully independent life of 100 years, followed by an instantaneous death akin to turning off an electrical switch. I think we have progressively become more and more quarantined from the realities of death in recent decades. Most Australians die in hospital, and while 80% of Australians think that discussion about their end-of-life needs is important, less than a quarter have actually done so. Only recently, I attended the funeral of a member of my extended family, where I noted a real reluctance by anyone to enter the church because of the presence of the casket. At another funeral, I and my children, with my encouragement, were the only ones wanting to touch the dead body of my late uncle, which I encouraged as a way of saying goodbye and giving thanks in a loving way for all the things we shared. I use these examples from my own family to make a point. Fear of death and dying, of the unknown, of a loss of control, and dependence on others are powerful, emotive drivers of behaviour. Under the influence of that sort of fear and denial, it is easier to put one's hope in a magic pill that makes a dubious promise of a quick, painless death, where one is said never to become a burden on others. The desperation to believe all these unfounded guarantees trumps any concern about the risks of wrongful death for thousands of others of abusive process, and gives no respect to the lost opportunity for time to reflect, love, and be with another human being who may be hours or even years away from death. Death literacy is all about the empowerment of a person and their loved ones, to help them anticipate what is to come, to respect their preferences and priorities, and to reassure them that the things that bring fear to many of us in the dark of night, pain, isolation and despair, can be replaced with comfort, compassion and, to use a word seemingly monopolised by my opponents, dignity. Over the last few years, there have been many moves in the right direction relating to end-of-life care. Informal discussions about death and dying within families, between patients and GPs, and among many social and cultural groups are increasing. In Victoria, only 6 months ago, laws came into effect which encourage and enable a healthier approach to end-of-life care in the form of advanced care directives and substitute decision makers. These initiatives are most welcome, but they have not been given enough time to become embedded in the community. And they have not been accompanied by enhancement of the palliative care sector. In fact, I contend that the overwhelming focus on the divisive issues of assisted suicide and euthanasia have drained attention and resourcing away from where it should have gone, palliative care. And palliative care, when it is truly understood, is a concept which seems to enjoy almost universal support. To those who have argued for assisted suicide on the grounds of providing choice, I say this: there is little or no choice between suicidal palliative care when the availability of palliative care is often threadbare, and even less available to those without a tertiary degree or an affluent postcode. I now turn to subjecting the Victorian laws to scrutiny and fighting the battle elsewhere. The principal argument against assisted suicide and euthanasia is that you cannot make these laws safe. I said last year that I think you can drive a truck through the so-called safeguards in the Victorian legislation, and I genuinely hope that time proves me wrong. Usually, when bad legislation is framed, the effect is a waste of money, a delay in service provision, or the imposition of a burden upon part or all of the community. In this case, the so-called Voluntary Assisted Dying Act of 2017 has the capacity to result in wrongful deaths, and many of them. In the public debate, and then the parliamentary debate, all sorts of guarantees were offered. That all deaths would be voluntary, that death would be quick and painless, that nobody else would be placed at risk, that only those with months or less to live would be eligible, that other types of suicide would decline, that informed consent was inescapable, and that the criteria for eligibility would not expand. It falls to us now to use the tools at our disposal to hold the system and its proponents to account. In an era of unprecedented scrutiny of medical practice, it will require determination to shine light on this area, to hold this system of assisted suicide and euthanasia to account via the Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board, the Medical Board of Australia, the State Coroner, the Department of Health and Human Services, and via the Parliament of Victoria. Many necessary questions will be difficult to answer, such as the accuracy of diagnosis and prognosis, the effectiveness of the lethal drugs, and whether informed consent was really obtained. But we must take this part. I assert that here in Victoria, we must carefully understand and vigorously defend the place of conscientious objection. There must be no victimisation of the doctors, nurses and institutions that refuse to participate in assisted suicide. And I remind all my colleagues that refusal to participate in this process must never equate to a denial of the care to those who disagree with us. We must still and always walk the journey with our patients. Through last year's political debate, and to some extent even now, some proponents of assisted suicide sought to attack me personally, to marginalise and discredit me and my colleagues. Having spent over a decade speaking publicly on matters of ethics on behalf of the medical profession, it was a new experience to be labelled a religious zealot by my opponents, and more a case of the pot calling the kettle black. In the aftermath of the Victorian debate, efforts have been redoubled elsewhere to legalise assisted suicide and euthanasia. Proponents have sought to build momentum and use the template developed in Victoria, a parliamentary committee, an advisory panel to frame legislation and build a case, then a short, sharp parliamentary debate. It is tempting for some to think the battle is over, but I can tell you it is not. In the Federal Parliament in August, an attempt to remove the 20-year prohibition on territory laws favouring euthanasia, assisted suicide was defeated, despite a strong push to associate the issue with territory rights. To me, it was yet another attempt to confuse and distract MPs away from the main issue of end-of-life care. I thank the Senate for its courage in standing up for the vulnerable. Now the debate has moved to Western Australia and Queensland, and the rules have changed. No longer are private members' bills the order of the day. They are government-sponsored bills. In the aftermath of the Victorian debate, I am encouraged by the establishment and effectiveness of lobby groups, such as the Australian Care Alliance, which seeks to answer the previously uncontested assertions of well-resourced groups pursuing assisted suicide. We will not shy away from making the case for an end-of-life care system of which we can all be proud. Finally, I wish to speak about caring for Australians in such a way as to render assisted suicide and euthanasia unnecessary. As I mentioned earlier, this goal is ambitious, but absolutely achievable if the determination is there. The principles of universal access and expert care are not new to the Australian health system. Medicare has been in place since 1984, and I am proud to live and practice medicine in a nation where the first question I always get to ask a patient is, how can I help you? And not to ask myself whether they have the means to afford the care they need. In the same way, palliative care must be enhanced at many levels to enable universal access and care on the basis of need rather than means. The evidence clearly shows that patients are not referred to palliative care early enough. There is inadequate recognition that palliative care should occur in parallel with curative care. There needs to be a greater recognition of the place for palliative care skills across the medical profession, and the need for greater numbers of trainees and specialists in hospital and community-based palliative care. The eternal cost shifting between state and federal governments over health funding, which includes palliative care, needs to change to enable better care for dying patients when and where they need it. And we must never forget that we have to care for the family and friends of the dying patient. They too feel vulnerable and powerless, may not understand what their loved one needs, or worse, understand exactly what they need and yet be unable to provide what is required. And so, I am back to where I began in 2012. I believe we can and must do better in the way we care for our loved ones, patients, and ourselves near the end of our lives. And that can be achieved by improving our understanding, expertise, and service delivery in the realm of palliative care. It will never be achieved by providing the means to patients to simply kill themselves. As a doctor, I have the expertise to relieve suffering, to provide care and compassion, and thus enable a good death. I have an obligation to provide the best possible care and to walk with my patients and their loved ones. I am not a vending machine. I close with a quote from Senator Pat Dodson in his contribution to the Senate debate in August. If we give one person the right to make that decision, that is, to assist in committing suicide, we as a whole are affected. If we give one family that right, we as a whole are affected. If we give one state or territory that right, we as a country are affected. If we give one nation the right to determine life, our common humanity is affected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I thank you, well, spoke with great passion, but I thank you also for the intellectual tools that I will need as I continue that debate myself. And I'm also thinking on a personal level, I'm not sure that anybody in my family has had that conversation about what we think that's going to look like, and I'm making a resolution now that I'm going to have some of those conversations as well. Yes, let's make the legislation unnecessary. Associate Professor Natasha Michael is Director of Palliative Care at Cabrini Health and an Adjunct Professor at the University of Notre Dame in Sydney at the School of Medicine there. And Natasha, can I just say, guys, I think Natasha is the person we'd all want being our doctor, our specialist, if we ever come to need palliative care. Natasha, if you'd like to address us.
I would like to thank the Office of Justice and Peace for the invitation to deliver to this year's lecture with Stephen. Both Stephen and I, over the last 24 or more months, have had the privilege of working with many committed to maintaining our ethic of care in the face of this legislation. Personally, as a newcomer to Australia, it was a revelation to me as to the dedication and the talent that exists within and outside of our communities, and the opportunity to work with so many who gave much of their time freely and generously. I'm simply a physician, and medicine is my craft. So I must thank the following people for enlightening conversations and generosity of time and spirit in preparation for today. Associate Professor Claire O'Callaghan, who I work with, Professor Sandy Lynch and Xavier Simmons at the Institute of Ethics and Society at the University of Notre Dame, Julia Trimboli from Mercy Health, Dr. Andy Mullins, and Anne Spence. It may seem anachronistic to speak of hope and not despair at a point when we embark on extraordinary times in the state of Victoria. and indeed possibly all of Australia. Despair may seem the salient emotion. However, hope is the antidote to despair, and it is the presupposition behind the human will to live. In our context today, I hope we think of hope not as a mere expectation or a desire for something good, but we consider hope as a virtue bestowed through grace, particularly within our Christian tradition. So we keep that in mind. You may have come today to hear all the reasons for which we do not and must not support legislation from me. But I'm going to go a little bit off centre. It's been a bit of a challenge, but I'll try. I hope to provide us with the opportunity to reflect on two things. Firstly, why hope is necessary at this time, and secondly, what we must do to engender hope in all those we encounter in our service, particularly those who may inquire about voluntary assisted dying or who are considering prematurely ending their lives. Our standard way of posing the impact of legislation is to discuss the conflict between personal autonomy and state paternalism. But the liberal state on its whole usually adopts a stance of neutrality in matters pertaining to death. Our Christian, and indeed our palliative care tradition, however, embodies a moral tradition of fundamental convictions about what it means to die well. This legislation will thus pose both professional and practical challenges, and it will ask if our moral traditions should be reaffirmed or indeed modified to adapt to new caregiving realities of legislative and patient demand and physician compliance. More importantly, as a community, we need to ask if our tradition can be modified without compromising our fundamental ethic of care. It is for these reasons that hope must remain central to our discourse. We will start by reflecting on the words of Cardinal Bernardin, the Archbishop of Chicago, who, as he was suffering from pancreatic cancer in 1995, released his pastoral letter on healthcare, A Sign of Hope. Here he reminds us of what we are called and indeed empowered to do. Although illness brings chaos and undermines hope in life, we seek to comfort those who are ill, whether or not they can be physically cured. We do so by being a sign of hope, so that others may live and die in hope. In this we find a Christian vocation that makes our healthcare truly distinctive. It is the reason we are present to believers and non-believers alike. Similarly, Dame Cicely Saunders, founder of the modern hospice movement, speaks of hope. While still a medical student in 1958, she wrote in the St. Thomas Hospital Gazette that the door of hope must be shut slowly and gently. It was in these early years of the emergence of the philosophy of hospice care that Cicely was offering us the option of a middle path between two undesirable ways of caring for the dying: curative high-technology medicine on one hand, and death by assisted suicide or euthanasia on the other. Indeed, Saunders argues that the hospice approach, with its emphasis on attending to the needs of the whole person and offering support to the family, embodies the only possible method of compassion and care for the patient. This ethic of compassion and care is a cornerstone of the principle of Catholic teaching and hospice care. Death, we believe, should never be hastened or postponed. We see death not as an enemy to be fought, and argue that we provide a positive alternative to the philosophy of practice of self-deliverance or suicide. But it is this ideology in itself that creates a moral tension for us working in healthcare and palliative care. The moral vision of hospice articulates that we provide patients with a control over the quality of their life they can experience in their dying. But this scope of patient control does not extend to the decision to terminate life by medical assistance or suicide, and some have challenged me on this. So we must understand what the modern patient encounters. The modern patient encounters death as a failure. It is, as illustrated by Ivan Illich's critique of the medicalization of dying in the 1970s, society has lost the capacity to accept death and suffering as meaningful aspects of life, being in a state of total war against death at all stages of life. Alongside this sits a crippling of personal and family care, a devaluing of traditional rituals surrounding death and dying, and a form of social control. As innovations in medicine advance, the boundaries between life and death seem increasingly blurred, to the point that some propose that it's even overreaching to suggest that we can identify a clear moment of death. The plea for a hastened death that we face now has both literary motive and psychological pattern. It is both an individual and communal response to pain and death. It is a passionate expression of what Cicely Saunders describes as total pain, a triggering of a myriad of suffering, bringing the physical, psychological, spiritual, and emotional self into a disequilibrium. It is a plea that calls for a therapeutic alliance, non-judgmental care, and a cry for unfailing presence. Palliative care has encouraged medicine and society to be gentler in its acceptance of death. It recognizes that for the ill, disease is a ravaging force that inexorably conquers. For the patient, the convolutions of modern medicine, the uncertainty of therapeutics, the conundrum of multiple doctors across multiple sites for multiple treatments brings an uncertain horizon and instills an existential anguish. Their journey of illness is ultimately alienating and lonely. Many seek relational connections, but isolation and reticence promotes withdrawal. Frailty, the loss of mental clarity, the dependence on others for bodily functions, the inability to preserve a sense of self, spirals into a state of demoralization and depression. For many, it is the desperation for the restoration of dignity and the return of normality that drives the desire for death. I want to die, let me die, not kill me. It is with an understanding of this that we must seek to engender hope in the dying. But how do we do this? Firstly, we must do so by continuing to welcome all to our services. This is the foundation of our Christian tradition of hospitality. In the context of legislation, we will be faced with those in our workplaces and institutions who may be actively seeking voluntary assisted dying, be requesting transfers out for access, who commit suicide under our watch in our community and inpatient services, who threaten and taunt our staff. And believe me, this is already happening. This already poses many challenges to us prior to the legislation being enacted. But with this, we must sustain our spirit of hospitality through meaningful and respectful conversation, whilst maintaining our ethic of care. To be genuinely hospitable, our actions must have appropriate motives. Our actions and responses must never be undertaken in bad faith, with resentment, or purely out of duty. Our interactions must be born out of a genuine interaction and a disposition towards the care of a person in need, and by ensuring that we are truly available to those who make such demands. It is only through this can a therapeutic alliance occur. Only through this can the door of hope be widened, allowing for trust to mature. The 20th century French existentialist philosopher Gabriel Marcel reminds us that treating the other as a presence, as opposed to an object, is crucial to the act of making oneself available to the other. To say that one is truly available is to say that we have put all of our resources, material, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, at the service of the other. Secondly, to engender hope is to hold in front of the person the reality of love and the mercy of God, or a higher being for each person. To know that we are loved fills us with hope, and knowing that we are loved by another is the start of hope. Thus, despite our increasing demands to partake in the arena of policy and political debate, our true vocation must remain at the bedside of the patient, to face the laments and the pleas, even then of a hastened death. The patient's cry must be heard in the context of the lamentation that we hear in the 22nd Psalm. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. The key failure in the impending legislation is a failure to provide an opportunity to listen to this lament. With the lack of provision of an opportunity to bring about hope, we fail to recognize the lament as a source of suffering, a cry of total pain. The outflow of a deep inner struggle for many is the agony for a search of meaning in suffering. The fear of future, regrets of the past, unresolved guilt, concern of burden, It is a cry of fear, anger, and despair, addressed to God, family, doctor, or caregiver. If the response to suffering is the lament, then why is this lament so invisible to so many? First, we must make a choice to listen to a narrative. But a lament can easily be disguised. A shrug, a sigh, or even a fixed smile, so easily missed by the untrained eye. But the ultimate state of despair and loss, and therefore the risk, is found in the person who is unable to lament, the inability to express their mourning. The elderly, the disabled, the cognitively impaired, the poor, and believe me, the privileged, the educated, and the informed. A request for voluntary assisted dying, euthanasia, assisted suicide must be viewed as an opportunity to listen, to demonstrate concern, and this is when our door of hope must be truly widened. Patients, in my experience, respond most to authenticity, which I believe is the third way in which we must engender hope. That is the authentic way we bring to each other, the authenticity we bring to each that we encounter. Caring and compassion is necessary for healing, but caring and compassion cannot be faked. Patients value not just what we say, but we are as a manifestation of our character. The characteristics of authenticity, creativity, coherence, self-awareness, integrity, faith, spontaneity, vulnerability, humility, and conviction must be present both in us as individuals and within our institutions and organizations. To be authentic is to be vulnerable. Vulnerable as individuals and vulnerable as organizations. We also cannot develop our authenticity without others, who serve as a mirror in which we see our reflection. From authenticity flows compassion and care for our patients. Patients appreciate knowing that though we might see hundreds of patients a day, they are special at that moment. It is only through this we can create a space for healing to occur. Finally, now more than ever, those of us who care for the dying should be greatly attuned to the high significance of two existential acts that engender hope: giving thanks and forgiving. As we attend to the needs of the body and mind, we should enable the dying to do two of the most important things in human life: to acknowledge that one's life is a gift, and to untangle the strands of humanity that have been knotted up with rage and hatred. The simple and meaningful work undertaken by many palliative care services, providing biography services, life reviews through dignity therapy, music and art therapy that forms memory making and allows for legacy leaving, the pastoral provision of prayer, sacraments, reflections, meditation, the facilitation of family therapy sessions that allow for discourse, disclosure, and closure, the efforts made to achieve the bucket list of travels, holidays, hot air balloon rides, swims in the seas, weddings, baptisms, and pastoral meals in a palliative care unit, recognize the human need for meaning and purpose, and the significance of giving thanks. Similarly, to forgive at the end of one's life is not to forget, but to refuse to carry the rage against hatred of and rejection of another human being into death. As we conclude for the evening, we reflect that now marks a crucial time where our institutional and organizational presence must no longer be confined to bricks and mortar. John Curley, writing on Catholic collaborations, urges us now to reflect on how obstacles can be turned to opportunities and challenges that have appeared insurmountable could be overcome. We have seen many such fine collaborations of this across Catholic healthcare in Victoria. The refugee hub in the northern suburbs between St Vincent's and Cabrini Health, the training of medical students in palliative care across Mercy Health, Cabrini Health, Calvary Bethlehem, and the University of Notre Dame, the partnerships of care packages, the collaborations in community palliative care services. In the time period leading up to this legislation, we encountered many examples of this, with working groups that formed, lobbied, and now still continues to advocate. The formation, as Stephen mentioned, of the Australian Care Alliance, the challenges we have made to professional bodies to ensure we remain committed to our Hippocratic tradition of medicine, and very importantly now, the excellent collaborative work undertaken by the Catholic Health Australia Task Force, led by Dr. Dan Fleming across Catholic healthcare sectors in Australia, providing for a unified approach to our response. As a people of hope, we must seek opportunities that come with the challenges of legislation, to reach out to those who even do not share our ethic of care, to show and lead by example in excellence. This is a concrete example of the tangible realization at this time that the Catholic ministry is what we all hold in common, and our obligations to ensure that the right people are present at the right time in the right room to produce the right results. This is a time for us to disregard conventional reality and substitute it with a compelling paradox of hope. I can think of no better example of hope at the end of life than the Pieta. The Christ, though dead, is still alive. His veins distended by the pulse of life, his body limp with sleep, his torso flowing into the mold of his mother's arm and lap. The Virgin, traditionally represented as a woman disfigured by grief, here is much younger than her son. While the Christ is life-size, the Virgin is even bigger than life. Our message of hope in our Christian tradition lies in the story of the resurrection. Regardless of the religious identity of many who work within our organizations or institutions of care, their beliefs and convictions, these times ask that we hold the door of hope wide open, welcoming all with our genuine hospitality, listening with authenticity, providing a prudent presence that allows for our vulnerability, ensuring that we create a space for true healing to occur. This is another way to win this war. So thank you very much.